There are some times when as soon as I see a game, I know that it's going to be a video, and Turnip Boy Commits Tax Evasion was definitely one of those times. It promised to be a sort of Zelda-inspired, short but sweet adventure all about vegetables committing tax evasion, and I couldn't really say no to that. Before we get started though, this game is pretty short and is definitely the kind of thing that you should experience if you're at all interested in adventure games like this. So I tried not to spoil too much. I didn't show any of like the last areas or the final boss or the ending or anything like that. None of that is being shown, but since it's a relatively short game, there's only so much that is actually safe to show, so you could consider some of the stuff in the background as being spoilers, because, you know, this game is pretty much all killer, no filler, basically. It is all adventure, all dungeon, all story and stuff. There isn't really any dead space, any downtime, which is actually a good thing, because, like I said, it's quite short, but all of its time feels like it's used very effectively. But that is exactly what Turnip Boy Commits Tax Evasion actually is. It is a top-down 2D Zelda-inspired adventure game. It's a little bit of light combat, some dungeon crawling, some puzzle solving, and some side questing up to an end. And like I said, since it's quite short, it fills all of its time very effectively. I actually beat it the first time in about 2 hours or so, and you can 100% it in closer to 3. There are different endings depending on how many of the documents that you find and rip up, because your character just cannot stop ripping up tax documents and things. And the side quests and things are where you find a lot of that stuff. So in order to 100% the game and get the best ending, the main ending, you have to do all the side quests, find all the documents and all that stuff, and that can be done in about 3 hours roughly. Obviously, it's going to depend on how you play. My cat apparently has a lot to say about this game too, but anyway, you start off just without anything, and you have to figure out how to actually get started, and you will get various tools that you will use along the way, and the gameplay is based around finding tools and items that you will use to solve puzzles. So it uses that classic sort of Zelda formula of you will get some sort of item, some sort of tool to use, and it will allow you to solve more puzzles around the world, which will unlock new areas, and of course you'll use it in the next dungeon to solve all the puzzles, to get through it, to get to the end, to get to a new tool. You know, it's a very tried and true formula, and this game uses it very well, albeit in a very simplistic way. You'll get things like a watering can that lets you water various plants to grow them, and you can even water a sword plant to give you this turnip sword thing that you see in the background right now that you can use for the basic combat. You'll also find other sort of passive items like boots that let you kick these explosive berry thingies around the place, gloves that let you push blocks, you know, all your sort of Zelda staples really. Even upgraded melee weapons with extra capabilities like a shovel that does more damage and lets you pry open hatches in the late game. So it's all familiar if you've played a game like this before, but it's all very silly and vegetable themed. But of course the main draw of a game like this is its story and all the places that you'll be going. In this case, the world is actually quite small, which is a good thing since there are lots of side quests to do. You might be backtracking here and there, but the backtracking takes such little time to do that it's not really a big deal, and you're often on the way to a new area of the map. Anyway, the map is sort of laid out where the place you start is like right in the middle, and all of the other areas that you'll be going to branch off to the north, south, east, and west of it, so that you always have a very clear layout in your mind of how this map is constructed, since you go towards the middle to go back home, and then you go off in any of the individual directions to get to the other areas and dungeons and things. So it doesn't have a map, but it doesn't really need one because it's laid out very intuitively, and it's easy to remember where each individual NPC was that you might have a side quest waiting for. It's laid out in such a way that you'll never spend more than about 60 seconds or so to actually turn in a side quest. About the longest track that you'll get is a can of spray paint to this guy that wants to vandalize a road, and it only takes, like I said, about 60 seconds or so to get from the area that you get the paint and then back to him. It's all pretty quick. But of course the standout star of the game, as you would expect, is the game's sense of humor. It is all based around like silly tax jokes and other things like that. All these vegetables have very interesting personalities, and there are also some fruit and some sweets here and there to talk to as well. They're all like sentient food basically, and in order to navigate your way around the world and progress the story and do the side quests and that, you'll have to talk to all these individual NPCs, and they all have something interesting to say. They all have very silly dialogue, and there's a lot of jokes, but it's not really a lot of referential humor or anything. The jokes are pretty self-contained, and this is probably my favorite aspect of the game, is how the pacing keeps itself going really well. Like I said, there's never any dead space in this game. Since you will only be ever running like about a minute tops to go and do a side quest, the game never feels padded out. It feels like all the jokes and all the interactions and all the puzzles and all the bosses and things, they all flow in a really nice pace that never really lets up from beginning to end. That is one of the advantages of having a game that's so short, is you have very direct control of the pacing. The player is never like grinding out mobs in a dungeon somewhere or anything like that. It's all very deliberately paced, very well timed. All of the jokes have like really nice timing because you never feel annoyed that the game has made you do a whole bunch of busy work that you didn't feel that you needed to do. So the jokes have just enough time to hit you, and then you move on to the next one. You might see like a silly achievement pop up that's like the punchline of a side quest or something, and then you're already moving on to the next bit, so it all happens really fast. The dungeons generally have some sort of central mechanic, as you would expect, that uses a new tool that you just got or that you will get in the dungeon. So you'll have like block pushing puzzles, fire spreading puzzles, watering can puzzles, and there are even orange and blue portals, yes, that you will have to use to get through certain areas. The boss fights themselves are all also puzzle bosses. You can just smack them with your sword, but generally speaking, there's a faster, more effective way to actually get through the boss fights, from kicking explosive berries into them to using portals to make an easier path to evade their attacks, and also to use environmental hazards against them. There's even a boss later on in the game, very late in the game, that you have to use the fire spreading stuff against to prevent them from grabbing you and doing tons of damage to you. The bosses are actually pretty fun because they don't overstay their welcome like everything else in this game. They're all done pretty quickly, but they all have a interesting and satisfying way to actually take them out that makes them feel worthwhile to do. And of course, in between all the dungeons, you'll be exploring the world itself. Like I said, it's very small, but there is still lots to explore, and the world also tends to have a bit of environmental puzzling to get through certain areas, ensuring that sort of organic progression that tells you that what the next area is, because you remember there was a block you couldn't push behind a certain tree or whatever, so you know where to go next because you now have the ability to access those bits, so the world opens up organically depending on what tools you currently have at your disposal. And although you might not expect it, there's actual lore in this world. Like, there's an actual story and a backstory to why the world is the way that it is. And for a game that's got a lot of jokes in it, you think that it might be just pure comedy all the way through, but there's actually a bit of serious lore to it that's actually pretty well delivered in these diary entries and some environmental storytelling in some of the later areas of the game that help to tell you how the world got this way and what happened before you evaded your taxes and started the whole game off. So like the last two dungeons and the last couple of bosses are all tied into this extra bit of lore that teaches you how the world got the way that it currently is, and it's actually well done. I mean, like I said, you wouldn't necessarily expect that in a game that's mostly jokes because you don't really need that per se, but the fact that it's there shows just that extra bit of care and attention that went into the game that clearly has had a lot of love and attention put into it up to this point. It's also very much worth actually getting that final ending, getting all of the side quests done, ripping up all of the documents and everything so that you can get the final, more satisfying ending. It's worth seeing it because the game actually makes you care about itself and about its characters and about the state of the world. By the time that the game is about to end, you actually do want to know what really happens, which is pretty cool actually. The game also has some really nice music. The soundtrack is worthy of mention, by the way, because each of the individual dungeons have their own soundtracks as well as different tracks for exploring the world. You know, like the creepy graveyard track and the crazy nuclear bunker track with the siren in the background and stuff like that. Each area has a really nice atmospheric soundtrack that actually adds a lot to the exploration of them. But without wanting to say too much more about the game and spoiling anything major, it really is the kind of thing that you should check out. It is absolutely worth playing. It's only $14.99, which is a pretty solid price in my opinion for something that is also going to be getting some content updates soon, by the way. We'll go on to that in just a second, but it is absolutely worth experiencing at least once all the way through, 100% completion, so that you can see everything, understand the lore behind the world because it's kind of interesting, and get the final ultimate ending. The music is great, the art style is adorable, and it actually has some really funny dialogue and a lot of very silly moments that are very memorable. It's definitely a memorable game in terms of being short but filled with good dialogue and stuff like that. So yeah, that's that. And the update that I mentioned, there's going to be some bug fix updates coming in the future. It's not really a buggy game right now, but as with any game, there might be some small bugs that remain to be squashed, so they're working on that. But they're also, in the coming months, it says, so there's no specific release date, but soon-ish, there's going to be a pretty large-sounding update, version 1.1, that's going to add a replayable sort of roguelite dungeon to the game that's apparently going to have its own story. It's going to have its own set of items within the dungeon separate from the rest of the game, so that'll give this dungeon sort of its own background story and its own feel, really. So that actually sounds really cool, and I'm excited to see what they actually bring with it, because it sounds like a whole nother, almost like a whole new story arc basically for the game, and it's going to be a free update to everyone that owns the game. So when that comes out, this game will be even easier to recommend, but even as it stands right now, it is very easy to recommend because it's just so funny, so memorable. There are some great moments. I love the part where the strawberry draws manga of you and you rip it up and she gets upset and you tell her to stop, which is a really funny moment because your character normally doesn't speak to anyone, so they break their silence just for that one particular moment. And like I said, the game itself is just very memorable. I remember every aspect of the journey because it's so short, so it's easy to remember, but also because it's just really genuinely funny. It's well written, it's all well timed, and the dungeons are fun. The puzzles are unique enough in each one to feel different, so it never feels like like you're doing the same thing over and over. The bosses are varied enough to actually feel, like I mentioned, worth fighting, because they each have their own sort of puzzle mechanics to beat them effectively. And of course you have the different endings that you can achieve depending on how well you do with helping out all of the residents of Vegieville at large. And apparently the game might be rife for a bit more expansion even after that big roguelite dungeon update, because they have said that they have other ideas that are currently in the planning stages that they're not ready to talk about just yet, but there may be some more stuff even after that update in the future that adds even more to the game. So yeah, that's Turnip Boy Commits Tax Evasion. So if you want a really genuinely fun and funny game about a sentient root vegetable committing federal crimes that has better world building than Destiny, then look no further, because that's exactly what you got here. Thank you guys very much for watching. The link will be in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you want to go check it out yourself. I highly recommend experiencing it at least once, and I'll see you next time.